introduce you to Mike Armiger. Mike is, for those of you who haven't met him, is an independent education and mental health advisor, and he's going to share his perspective on how we equip leaders to support staff well-being, and also share with you his approach to peer reflection, and to talk a little bit about hope, which is well needed. So I'm really delighted to have Mike here, and I will hand over, Mike. Thanks a million.
So sorry, everybody. My sound has gone off my end, so I can't hear a word that anybody is saying. But as long as you can hear me for the time being, that's all that matters. So at the end of this, I'll just really enjoy seeing Sinead talk and try and interpret what she's saying through her best possible mime. That will be a game that we can all play at the end. How fun. It's really good to be with you all. I'm sorry for those of you that had to endure me yesterday, and you've got to endure me again today. I can only apologise. Clearly, Sinead needs to book much better people with much better haircuts. But don't get me started on that. It's really good to see you all. It's good to see some familiar faces. I see some people that I've met before, but everybody is very, very welcome. I hope you come to today's session with a brew and a biscuit, and just a generally okay sense of feeling all right this morning. And if you're not, hopefully maybe by the end of the session you might feel hopefully a little bit better. Certainly my aim is not to make you feel any worse. It's to hopefully instill some things that we can maybe do and go forward with. I want to try and strike a balance today with things that we can do for ourselves and things that we can do for our staff. One of the things that I have a concern with at the moment, just to give you a tiny little bit of context so you don't think that I'm someone that has not been near a school in the last goodness knows how many years. I work executively across the trust of 9 pupil referral units and a couple of mainstream provisions executively. So my job really within education has been to support our heads and our leadership team and whole staff teams across all of those times. And of course, because we are full of vulnerable young people, all of our provisions have been open throughout. So one of the things that I constantly do when I go to see leaders at the moment is to say, right, there's lots of things we have to do, but let's just first of all just take some time to just sit, reflect, and to just give you the space and the time to offload. And we're going to talk about some things that we can possibly do to incorporate that in our work day today. I'm also hopefully going to give you some practical things to think about too. There are some models that I'm going to put forward for you, and you must please take away some of those models and think about how they fit and work for you. They're not prescriptive. Okay, they are a guideline, and they are something that you can use maybe to think about, and maybe you can adjust that model as you go and as you try it. Okay, so everything that I talk about here, you will know how to make it fit both for you and best for your staff. So without further ado, I am going to share my screen and hope that you can all see it. Mark, can you see my screen? Just a thumbs up would be great. Brilliant, thank you. Okay. So there's just a couple of things I want to start off with saying. Excuse me for the spacing on my slide. I forgot to press the space bar on the top one. To start with, I do understand for many of us that, education and working in it is an absolute blessing. Being able to sit with some of our young people and our staff members and see the things that we do is an absolute privilege, of course. But at the moment, and regularly as well, that can actually bring up quite a lot of sense of vulnerability and indeed overwhelm with the amount of challenges that we face. So there's just a couple of things I wanted to just point out on this without stating the obvious. One of the things is, for me, that there's a lot of talk at the moment about, making sure that, we're empathetic and all of those things, which pre-COVID we always would have been, of course. But I also think it's very important to talk about how we might need to adapt. So just before, I work in mental health services as well, and just before we went into the period of time where we saw increased hospital admissions and services had to drastically change during the peak of COVID, we sat and had a conversation. And it was something that I wish that we'd have had in education as well. And the conversation was talking about the fact that many people actually couldn't possibly do everything that they needed to do every single day and be empathetic, because empathy requires immersing yourself in somebody else's situation. And instead, what we talked about was the fact that actually what we needed to do was to be compassionate. And compassion involves wanting to alleviate other people's pain. So it's the same sort of principles, but without necessarily immersing ourselves. And we talked about this concept of capable calmness. And I find that concept of capable calmness really interesting, because I pride myself on being somebody who is generally very compassionate and somebody who wants to support other people as much as I possibly can. And I pride myself also on being somebody who is able to understand what it's like maybe to be in some of those positions. But at the moment, we have finite resources and there are limits on that. So it's not to say that we stop being compassionate and that we stop doing those things, but it's also okay for us to realize that our resources are limited and actually capable calmness might be the thing that we pursue. Because at the moment, having to be empathetic with everybody might be really, really challenging. So when we talk about empathy, I think we should maybe wonder whether or not we mean compassion, because the two can be very different, and it's worth just noting that. And it's something that, you know, if I had more time, I would absolutely explore with you all. And certainly something, if you want more information on, please get in touch and I will by all means send you that. But capable calmness is really something I think that we should be looking for, especially with the amount of guidance, especially with the ever-changing goalposts, both locally and nationally, and the constant questions and reassurance that we have. I was speaking to a head just the other day, and I was talking about the fact that as soon as new guidance comes out, I want to go through it, and you know, something came out the other day, and I was looking at it thinking, this is just absolutely unbelievable, and all of those things. And what I've realized is that actually, you know, me putting that up on social media, or me, you know, messaging somebody else and saying, you know, isn't this outrageous? And getting myself into that state is actually not really productive for myself and all the people around me as well. So I've had to learn personally the last couple of months to be able to take a step back, to digest the information first, and to always say, I'll come back to you with a reaction and some thoughts in good time. And that process has been very healthy for me, because it's made me realize what I'm projecting elsewhere. And that's not to say that I shouldn't have those spaces to be able to go, what on earth is this? And how on earth do I cope with this? But I'm being mindful about how I spill over in front of other people. Now, the last thing that I would also say, just on this topic before we go into some practicality, is that there are some times at the moment I've noticed with leaders where the relationships with their staff are changing, often in a very, very good way. People feel, in some provisions that I've been into, feel a little bit tighter, and they feel that there's a lot more of a human interaction between leaders and staff members, and that now there's less of a view of leadership of being, you know, these people that sit and make decisions, and it's more about the togetherness of the provision. And some of you would have had that already in your provisions. But relationships undoubtedly will change during difficult times, whether you become closer or whether things change slightly. And you might have to find, I certainly have, that those leadership relationships change and that the footing is different. And there's been times when actually, you know, there have been conversations with people in some of the provisions that I work with regularly that I haven't had before. And that's been wonderful to see. But it's also been wonderful to allow myself to open up a little bit more, not with, you know, my deepest worries or concerns, but just to share more of myself with other members of staff that maybe haven't seen that before, or maybe I haven't had the opportunity to do that before. And it's been useful. Others, of course, have had differing relationships, in the sense of some people are feeling maybe a little bit more distant, and that they need, for their own personal safety, their own state of mind and coping, to keep that distance, and that's also fine. So people's reactions and people's adaptations have been really interesting to watch. And actually, part of the work that we've been doing in the last month with some of the leaders is thinking about how we embrace that and what it looks like. And is there a different way that we're having to operate with certain groups of people? Are we filtering information in different areas for them? So I think those considerations are just important for me to start off with, by acknowledging them and acknowledging that this is an issue for many of you right now. So I just wanted to also mention, before we get onto some models and some practical things to think about, staff wellbeing is a very interesting one, and you know, Sinead will talk about this at length, very interestingly, and from an expert point of view for a very long period of time. But I always say to people, look, you can't inflict well-being. It just doesn't work. You can't mandate it, you can't force it. It has to be based on autonomy, because people's idea of well-being is very different. You know, I remember a couple of years ago, we had Staff Wellbeing Day, and it was an intern being cancelled, so we were out just to a Staff Wellbeing Day. And I was a deputy at the time, and I remember the head saying, right, we're going to have some staff wellbeing sessions. So we're going to have bake-off, and we're going to have yoga. I remember thinking, I hate baking, I quite like yoga, but I'm not sure I feel comfortable going full tree hugger and falafel eating, which is what I am, in front of everybody else and embracing my inner yoga being in front of everyone, because they might think that I'm way too into it. And I remember speaking to staff about it, and the feedback that came back was, we just need more choice. You know, what we need is space and a time, and, you know, can we maybe have some input on the activities? And there was also, you know, a talk at the time when, you know, the head said, well, you know, what about paintballing? I was like, no. So I think making sure at the moment that staff wellbeing isn't necessarily, because of the limited time and the limited spaces that we have, staff wellbeing will mean different things to different people. There will be people who will prefer to go home early, and that's okay. There will be people who will prefer to sit and be and sit with other people and talk and reflect. There will be people who will be quite happy to have an activity. And sometimes I know that the members of staff that we really need to be in those reflection spaces often end up going home. And actually those people that we would really like to sit and talk with maybe don't want to do that, and they want to go home, or they want to do an activity. And my message today is that that's okay, that's fine. And that's what they need right now. It might not be what they need further on down the line when we have less restrictions and possibly we have more options. But right now, that's okay. So place and autonomy and some element of control for staff wellbeing is really key, especially in a world at the moment that seems that things are out of control and that things are, you know, beyond our ability to influence. Those little things that we can influence that are right in front of us when the world outside seems quite difficult, it's really important. So place an autonomy and some choice and some ability to have some ownership over this is really key. And whilst I appreciate that, you know, togetherness is really what we want to aim for, and cohesive teamwork and all those things, you know, staff wellbeing doesn't need to necessarily be about a team. It's about individuals and a huge group of individuals within a school building. So autonomy is really important. So I just wanted to quickly talk to you about some things that we can think about physically. Now I talked on, what day are we today? It's this, isn't it? Gosh, days fly by. I talked yesterday about how we do different things at different times physically to manage our anxiety. But today I want to talk to you in a little bit of a different way about how we manage our immediate environment and our physicality of needs and how we support staff to regulate. So I'm very, very keen on regulation, as some of you who are in the chat will know, and this is something that we talk about with young people, but we don't really talk about with staff. And my concern about that is that actually we're all human beings and we all adapt in different ways. So we know that post and during impactful experiences, whether it's a positive one or whether it's an adverse one or whether it's a deeply traumatic one, our body adapts, our nervous systems, our ability to cope, our tolerance levels, our saturation levels, our rhythm in terms of breathing, all of those things adapt physically. And for many people, we are never the same as when we actually finish. We are never the same going into an experience as when we come out of one physically. Our nervous systems have to adapt in order for us to survive and cope with experiences. But that then means that when those experiences are not necessarily as intrusive, so we've got all of this going on in the background and we're struggling to cope with all of these different needs, when those needs are maybe not prominent and when we have some space and some time, whether it's in work or whether it's after the event itself, we're left with some of those adaptations, still affected by them. For some people, those adaptations mean that they're in sort of a lower state of arousal, but actually they may be a little bit more withdrawn, or that might result in low mood, or it might just result in, you know, withdrawing from other people's engagement, all of those things. It might also mean that actually our adaptations have taken us to more of a hyper state of alert, and that there's more of a sense of hyper arousal, so that there are more staff members and adults who are feeling a little bit more hypervigilant or maybe a little bit more alert and finding it difficult to downregulate. So this is, of course, completely human and completely understandable. And what we need to think about with this is actually how we resource people to regulate themselves for the day. So I'm going to take this from two strands. I'm going to take this from a leader's point of view. I'm going to take this from a staff member's point of view. So the first one to say is that actually, in terms of regulating leaders, there's a couple of things that I think about quite regularly. And some of the most important bits of work I've done over the last month have been around making sure that leaders create that environment where actually they're able to regulate themselves amongst all of the things that are going on. The first thing is, from a physical point of view, many of us are, of course, leaning over our laptops a lot, aren't we? And of course, our posture and our body positions, all of those things are changing. So it might be really appropriate for us to maybe think about some adjustments to that, whether it's ergonomic chairs, whether it's maybe standing up to do some work occasionally, whether it's elevating the screen, whether it's a cushion on the chair, whatever it is physically, because for many of us, our shoulders will naturally start to come up because we're in that state of tension and often a state of alertness. We find that our shoulders will naturally rise. And what happens with that, of course, is we might get lots of neck pain, all of those different things that many OTs would talk to you about. And for many people, actually, one of the things that people have mentioned is they're getting quite a lot of headaches. So a lot of people have mentioned about the links to shoulders rising and about the tension in the back of their necks. And some people have got some neck massages at home that they use to relieve some of those tension headaches. So that's been quite a useful conversation with our leaders. And many of them have reported that actually that's been very practical and very useful. That physical sense of tension in different areas of their upper body has been hard. Incorporating senses in our environment as well is really key. Whether it's, I walked into an office the other day, they had an oil diffuser, where they had, it was a very calm environment. They'd taken plants into their office. It was just some things that because they knew they were spending more time there, that they made adjustments to that space. And it was absolutely understandable for them to do so. But the key things that I wanted to say are, I think we need to be mindful about how we use our spaces too. So I know that for many people, spaces might be limited. But at the moment, for many of us, we need an increased sense of safety as leaders. And sometimes the spaces that we have in terms of our offices are understandably, taken over by meetings and lots of different things. And we don't necessarily have our own safe base to return to. So my communication with leaders has recently been, if you need to take a meeting and you need to do those things, if you have the space, of course, to do so, is it possible that where we can take those meetings in conference rooms if they're face-to-face? Or have we got another space that we can go to have some of those challenging conversations maybe? Or to take some of those, whatever it is. And I understand that for many of us, that's not possible. But where we do have the choice and where it is possible, might we be able to protect our own physical space and our own sense of safety and that own safe base to return to for ourselves? Because it's important for us as it is for other people. In the same way that we wouldn't necessarily go into maybe other people's spaces to have those challenging conversations, maybe it might be the case that we need to have some protection over ours where possible too. The other thing to say is that those protected spaces also might mean time. I had a wonderful PA in my last role who was absolutely amazing. And there would be times throughout the day where she knew that I just couldn't be disturbed for certain things unless, of course, it was absolutely crucial. And at the moment, of course, those needs seem to be changing day to day, and there's lots of things that we're having to respond to. So my wonder and my curiousness about this is there a way that we can have some sort of protected space, even if it's just for 20 minutes or something throughout the day? Because those things are really important for us to have some sort of continuity. Because I'm sure it will be very familiar to you if I'm in a full day of meetings or if I've got constant things I'm responding to, that the amount of emails that I then have to come back and respond to are unbelievable. So that protected space throughout the day, whether it's regular or whether it's just 10 minutes to be able to get through things, is really key in order to function systematically. And the last thing on this slide to just mention as well is that, actually in certain places in the world, in Scandinavia, for example, they have 20-minute rule breaks. If you're online and if you're on screen time, they say to people, you need to get up, you need to have a break from that. So it's really important that we maybe utilise some of that as well. And I'll talk about how we regulate staff members on my next slide. But I think those breaks are really crucial. When I'm delivering training online, some of the things that I do is say, right, we're going to have a 15-minute break here. We're still sticking to those breaks. We are taking the full hour for lunch. if you're coming in from home, you know, wherever you're dining in from, we are having a full hour so that you can actually sit and you can relax, or you can catch up some other things you need to do. So making sure that we're keeping to that, and not just presuming that because we're online that we can work just, you know, twice as hard and get through twice as much, I think is quite flawed. So we need to make sure that we're embracing those breaks, because the more regulated we are, the more calmer we are, the more safe we feel. That reflects on our staff, and that reflects on our young people too. So just things to think about, and I reflect this in policy. Okay, so Bruce Perry, Dr. Bruce Perry, over the Boston Trauma Centre, does a huge amount of work around emotional regulation, and it's something that I embrace within policy. So, for instance, in behaviour policy and wellbeing policies, in how we respond to children and young people's needs, our students have that in policy. So we take the fact that actually, before we ask people to reason and reflect, what we really need to do is we need to regulate them. Now, Bruce Perry actually meant regulate as in, you know, we talk to them about it's okay, it's safe, and we use it verbally. I talk about more using that physically. And that might be at the moment for some of our students. It might be walking and talking. It might be actually incorporating movements and those things. But in terms of staff, we have to take exactly the same approach. Again, it's a human approach. It's not necessarily one which is down to developmental age or physical age, chronological age, all those things. We have to try and understand that for many staff members, they need exactly the same approach right now. So there's a couple of things that I've done personally and that I've seen other leaders do, which have been really, really useful. So first of all, regulation aids in meetings has been really good. So actually, one of the meetings that I had the other day, everybody was given a scribble pad, and they said, right, so throughout all of our meetings, you don't have to take notes. You know, if you want to doodle, if you want to scribble, it's absolutely fine. You know, many people do that anyway. You know, I'm terrible for doodling on policies and all of those things. But actually allowing people to regulate themselves and their emotional state so that they are able to be more reflective and more reasoned and able to relate more is really key. It might be that we incorporate movement. I had a walking meeting yesterday with the heads. We sort of went out and had 15 minutes where we were walking around site, outside, you know, with our coats on. And that was a nice break for them, just, you know, from the online element, but also incorporating movement and being able to regulate their emotional state. Also, you know, utilising different spaces has been key. So whether it's outside, or there's been a couple of times with certain members of staff where I've really needed to focus for an hour and I've needed to take that meeting off site. Now, there is a huge reluctance at the moment, obviously, for people to be leaving site, and there are restrictions that we obviously have to think about. There's no doubt. I'm not suggesting it's an easy thing to do by any means, but often what happens and what stops us from doing that is guilt and concern. You know, actually, is it feasible that there are other people that will be in charge and things will be okay if I took half an hour out or 45 minutes to take that meeting just over the road or whatever? You know, and allowing other leaders maybe to do that too, I think is really important, because I don't know about you, but if I'm taking a meeting on site, I've got constant knocks at the door. I've got people that are in and out. I've got constant things that I've got to respond to. You know, sometimes I might have mistakenly left my email open and I can see the emails coming in. You know, so all of those things don't help me to be present and regulated. So utilising different space is really important. The last thing I'd maybe think about on regulation for meetings or events as well is to think about, you know, can we incorporate some listening time into that as well? So, you know, if you've got a staff member coming to see us about something, you know, can we just say, you know, can we catch up for 10 minutes before or after you talk to me about the issue that we're feeling, that you're experiencing? And occasionally, you know, some people will say, well, no, I'm okay, thanks. Other people will say, yeah, that'd be great. So, you know, time spent listening is never, ever, ever wasted. I think it's really key that actually, you know, the person that's listening in the room is often the person that is, you know, gleaming in the most and trying to attune to the other person, allowing people to feel heard. And I'll show you through some of the models in a second, is really vital for many of our staff members right now. So I'm not going to go through this, but I've just talked about there will be some staff members who are maybe struggling to respond to some students' needs at the moment, and who are maybe at a quicker sense of overwhelm than maybe they were before. So some guidance around regulating our own emotional state with learners is probably really important at the moment, especially some children who are very dysregulated and really struggling to keep it together. You know, for staff members to expect to deal with everything else that's going on at the moment, as well as those, is hard. And as much as we have very skilled workforce in this area, it's also important to understand that people are going to fluctuate, aren't they? There will be times where people are less able to cope with things that they maybe would be previously before. So, giving guidance on regulating our own emotional state with students is really key. So thinking about ways that, in the classroom that they can buy time and that they can resource themselves. I always talk about, and again, it's pretty self-explanatory, but if we're dealing with incidents with students, I always talk about, needing to buy time, whether they can say, can I have a conversation with you afterwards, or I'll speak to you at the end, or maybe I don't need to have that conversation then, I can maybe have it later. And often what I talk about is, resourcing ourselves after that possible confrontation or that emotional exchange. And often that resource might be, actually going and speaking to another student who is really kind and really, supportive or funny, to help us get that variance and that ability to reflect on the fact that not everything's terrible in that classroom at that time. Whether it's having a drink, whether it's being able to speak to a colleague, whether it's being able to just default to a calmer stance, whatever it is. So we have to support our staff to regulate in the classroom as well. And that's a consideration that I know that many of you would have already thought about and probably published your own thinking, your own advice. But making sure that we've got that as a consideration at the moment is key. Many of you will be doing this regularly anyway. But for me, it's something I've always done every half term in management. And it's always been to just review the routines that we've got. For many staff members and for many young people, routines are the way of getting through the days, aren't they? And they're often ways of coping with very challenging logistical circumstances and often emotional circumstances. So often, much of what we see reflected in staff and young people's behaviour could possibly be rectified with the routine. So, if that's the case, how often are we reviewing our routines? I know for many people, we're sort of keeping things the same, getting to half term and reviewing it then, and maybe thinking about making those changes from half term onwards. And we're trying to keep things very, very routine and very regular. And that's a really good approach. But making sure that we're reviewing things as we're going is really important. At the moment, what's hard, and I was talking about this in a practical sense the other day, is that it's difficult for leaders to be out and seeing those routines take place because there's lots of things that they're having to consider. So actually, making sure that we've got constant feedback sources from those routines of, can we say to staff members, can you have a look and see how that routine's operating? Can you feed back to me and let me know? Can we use our middle leaders in that way as well to review those routines? Might be a really good idea also. So I just wanted to touch on this very, very briefly because it's something that came up yesterday, and it's also something that's come up a few times now, about language, about how we describe other people. People who are maybe off with stress at the moment and really struggling, with all of the various things that they're balancing. And of course, what's challenging about that is that, many staff will maybe make these one-off comments. Of course, don't necessarily mean harm. But they also, it's the drip, drip, drip effect, isn't it? That actually, if it's not challenged and if we're not making sure that our language is compassionate, then it can build in and infiltrate belief systems and cultures. So making sure that we're not throwing out phrases like, they're self-isolating again. Oh yeah, they're isolating, are they? That's something which has come in a couple of times. There's no doubt about that, to some of the language that I've seen in some provision. So one of the things I said to leaders is just make sure that we're being clear that actually, people aren't choosing to isolate, they're following government guidelines. And that's well beyond our, our ability to influence. This is not our decision, it's not their decision, it's something that they're having to follow. And I think that's just really important to put out there because, and I said to somebody the other day, it's a duty to protect other people. It's not just about ourselves, it's about protecting others as well. So actually putting those different slants on it, I think is really key, but being mindful of the language that we're using to describe staff members who are finding it difficult is always a good idea, but especially a good idea at the moment. I, always used to have a real big problem with, NQTs, for instance, who would be coming in. My problem wasn't with NQTs, it was with the staff describing NQTs and saying, oh gosh, they're never going to hack it if they're looking stressed already, or, you wait till Christmas, mate, you might be singing and dancing now. And I always used to say to people, stop it, we need them. So don't do that. We need that enthusiasm. We need that energy. We need all of those things. So let's please keep it. So being mindful of the language that we're using, you know, and actually how it might infiltrate belief systems is really important for me. So I just wanted to touch on this briefly. And, you know, again, there will be various different resources that I use by educational support, which are brilliant, thinking about different areas of effective, being affected by current circumstances and overwhelm and all of those things. And, you know, whereas this talks about, you know, from a therapist angle, some of the language in here, it's essentially if you're therapeutic, then basically you're experiencing the same types of things. And we work therapeutically in education, don't we? Whether it's with CP issues, whether it's with SEMH, whatever it is, we are working therapeutically in that way. So, you know, it's just to mention that it might not necessarily always be burnout. You know, it might be compassion fatigue, the thing that we were talking about earlier. You know, there might be elements of vicarious elements in there, especially if we're dealing with safeguarding. So it's understandable that this might take many different forms. You have to excuse me, my 18-year-old dog is starting to kick off. So I'm hoping he's not going to do what I think he's going to do. He may well surprise me, but please bear with me if he does. I can only apologise. The other thing as well at the moment for me is that there's a real investment in middle leaders happening, which is great because, you know, in terms of management or in terms of dealing with issues, you know, we're having to rely on them a lot more, especially in terms of logistics and geographically. You know, if we're split into hubs or if we're split into bubbles, all of those different things, we're relying on those middle leaders. So my question is that if we're relying on them more, do we need to think about actually, have they got additional training in order to carry out those duties? One of the things that was identified the other day across one of the trusts that I work with is that some of the middle leaders haven't had supervision training or haven't had line management training. You know, they've come up to their roles quite quickly and they haven't, because of everything that's going on, they haven't had that routine course, yet they're having to do this most days. So it's really important to identify if there are any training needs there that we might need to consider. The also thing, though, in a positive form, is that our staff actually responding to these different voices. It's really important for us to consider that, isn't it? That they may well at some point actually be responding to this cascading of information in this way, you know, very organically, and it might be something that is sustainable going forward and that we take out of this. One of the things which came up the other day was that obviously we all go on briefing on Teams, and actually, you know, if it's me standing there or a head that stood there giving that information out, often, you know, some of us always switch off during briefing, even if we're the ones that are on the receiving end of it, don't we? We don't so-call that information in. What's really interesting is that lots of people said in the provision I was in the other day, they said that what's happening is that they're having the briefing, obviously they're in their classroom having that briefing because they can't all go into the staff room. And what's really good is that they can sit and say, what did they say about that? What did they say? Or did you take any notes on that part? What were they talking? So actually, the information is a lot more effective. So that's kind of a consequence, you know, a positive one that we maybe didn't necessarily think about. So reflection at the moment for me is really important, and I don't mean reflection in necessarily sitting down and talking about all of your worries and your concerns. That's not what I'm saying. But for staff, building in those reflective spaces is really key, and whether that's peer reflection and a buddy system, whether it's thinking about you know, space and time in our own lives, whether it's us as a leader or whether it's the people that we're encouraging to, you know, I think for me, reflection at the moment is very important, and it doesn't need to be confrontational reflection. It doesn't need to be, you know, I need to sit down and spend time thinking about my issues. It might be that you spend time not thinking about them, and that's your reflection space. But for me, debrief processes at the moment are crucial, absolutely crucial. So for instance, in my trust, you know, we use a post-incident debrief anyway, whether it's a serious incident, whether it's an incident around behaviour, or whatever it is, you know, we have that debrief process. So is it the case that maybe we need to think about those debriefs in a bit more detail? Do we need to have that debrief process at the end of the day, maybe every day? Do we need to cascade that down and maybe monitor? Do we need a model? You know, what does that look like? The other thing as well to think about is that do we timetable some more reflection times in to our mornings or our afternoons? Do we timetable it, or does it happen organically? You will know your provisions best. But spending time building in that reflection, for me, is really important. I just wanted to give you a model, okay, to take away. And again, remember what I said at the start. It doesn't need to be that you take this model and use it exactly like this. You will know how to adjust it for your staff, and you will know what will work and what won't. But it's something to think about. And this is what we call spaces for listening. So this could be used in whether it's management, whether it is supervision, whether it is supportive meetings with members of staff, or whether it is peer reflection. You know, it could be in their own hubs that they do this. Basically, the way that it works is that there might be 6, there might be 8 members. The time depends on how many people you've got in that space. And what happens is that you just invite people for 1.5 minutes to 2 minutes to reflect on those questions. And you must be really strict with time as well, so that there's a rhythm to it. And often people say, well, do we need a model? Could we just do that? But the thing is that with a model, what sometimes helps is that we can take it into different directions if we want to. But if we start off in lots of different directions, it can be quite chaotic, maybe quite quickly. So starting with a model and maybe stretching it out is often a better way to work. So the way that this one works, and I use this for DSLs, so for our safeguarding leads at the moment, this is something that I hold virtually regularly for all of them. And what we do is we say, right, we've got 1.5 minutes to 2 minutes. And the first question is going to be, what's on your mind today? Or what do you find yourself sitting with at the moment? And they talk for 1.5 minutes to 2 minutes. And then I put my hand up with a smile and I say, okay, thank you very much. We don't necessarily discuss it. We don't necessarily say that. We then go on to the next person. And we move around in that sort of sharing circle type form. And then the second one is then, what are your reflections on what you've heard? The reason that question is important is because it allows people to relate to other people. So to say, yeah, what so-and-so said about that has really made me think about something that I could maybe do. And then thinking about what you're leaving the space with, what are you taking forward, or, how are you doing when you leave the space today, and what you're going to do whatever that question looks like. But what it does, it's amazing. We've used this in health as well. And what's amazing is that this sort of listening model is very informal. It's very freeing, but it allows people to just feel heard, and it allows people to speak freely where they need to, but in a structured way. And what we're not doing is we're not offering advice. We're not offering those things. We're just holding that space with people. And that might be what some of your staff need right now. And it might be, it would work better for other people. It might be, a certain group of people you're thinking of for that model. But I wanted to give you a model so that you can maybe take it away and have a think about that. And I will make sure, obviously, that these slides are available. So please don't worry about that. The other thing that I've done, and this was a really good reflection exercise with somebody that I was working independently with at the time. So it was with the Ed Psych, and they used to come in and do my supervision. And it was just really a reflection for me on myself, both personally and professionally. And for people at the moment, it might not be appropriate to do. And this is not something, of course, I'm saying you should definitely go and do, and you should definitely go and do this. This is something which is absolutely your choice to do. But what was really interesting was the forms of questions in there. Okay, so actually, I said, I remember them showing me, and I said, oh, I don't want to profile myself. And they said, no, it's not a profile. It's just identifying where your limits are and where things are. And the reason they said that this is important is because when you share this with myself, or when you share this with a colleague that you're close to, what happens is that if you're dealing with one of those things that we know, or if we're seeing some of these habits or qualities, then it means that we know that that's something that we can support you with, because we know it's potentially challenging for you and you might be near a saturation point. And this is born out of safeguarding needs originally. So, they said, look, what are the things that you're comfortable in? And I'd say, well, I'm comfortable dealing with most areas, to be honest. And, obviously, especially mental health. But the things I find really difficult, don't come to me with a blood-based injury. I'm definitely not the person to deal with that. I would if I absolutely have to, but I'm not good. But terminal illness for me is just, I find that very, very difficult to talk about. And I will deal with it as a CP case. I absolutely will, because it's important I do that. It's my duty. However, it will probably stretch me a little bit more. So the purpose of this is to do this. You can hear my dog again, maybe, apologies. Is to do this, and then for it to be shared with somebody they're comfortable sharing it with, so that if they know that that's an ongoing thing for us at the moment and that we're dealing with that, they're able to just keep an extra check out for us. Again, it's something that has to be based on autonomy, and it's something that you have to think about yourself, not to be inflicted. But I thought that these were really interesting questions, actually, the habits and qualities that can cause us stress. I just thought that was such an interesting way of wording it, that it's a strength, but even strengths can cause us extra stress, can't they? You know, actually, the fact that I find it difficult to say no. I remember a day where I said yes to goodness knows how many children, and yes, of course, I'll come over and see that recital. Yes, of course, I'll come out and watch that. Yes, of course, I'll come and listen to you read. And sorry, and actually, what I'd ended up with is not being able to see any of them because I'd overstretched myself so much that I didn't have the ability to go and see them. So I said yes to everybody, and in reality, I then had to say no. So, you know, I actually saying no a couple of times maybe allows us to say yes later. So it's really important maybe that this is a process that maybe we do by ourselves, but it's just a model I wanted to share with you. So let's finish on hope. I was given a very, very good piece of advice a very long time ago. I'm not really one to share advice. I think advice can sometimes be a little bit flawed, which I know is ironic, me sitting here talking to you today about advice. But I always think that it's, you know, there are certain things that stay with us, you know, some very wise words that people have said, and this was one of them, and it's probably more important to share now than ever before. And this person said to me once, you know, I was talking about the fact that, you know, all I saw around me was pain and suffering. You know, working in mental health services and education, this was I saw people struggling. And they said, well, you know, it's really important that we always operate with two lenses in life. And the one lens is being able to empathize and be compassionate and understand and see and validate people's pain, you know, and not ignore it, and that we can see that people are suffering and we want to alleviate that. That's a good thing. But they said the problem is that if we only see life through that lens, then we'll see it everywhere, and it's overwhelming and it's difficult to cope with. So they said the other thing that happens actually is that we have another lens, and that's the lens of hope. And if you look closely, and if you look even in the most difficult spaces, there are always hopeful factors. There always are. There are always people that are holding hands down the street, probably maybe less a little bit now, but there is always, you know, somebody smiling at a child. There's always somebody looking after somebody else. There's always somebody doing something kind. And our schools and our provisions, whatever it is, whether it's college, university, secondary or primary, early years, all of those different places have a huge amount of value and a huge amount of hope in them. So one of the things that I did after that piece of advice was I would go around certain points during the week, and I'd just try. I'd often go to reception, or I'd go to year 10. It was a great year group of year 10 that used to make me laugh and smile. And I'd just go to just see the very normal and regular things, and it would make me feel hopeful because I'd see some kindness, or I'd see all of these things operating in my provision. And actually what I used to remind myself of is that there were still so many good things happening and so many reasons to be hopeful right in front of me, even when the world outside seemed really difficult. And I think that's really important now, that whilst we recognize that things are difficult, we remember to put the other lens in, and we remember to seek out and see that hope. I'm going to give you two websites just to finish. I would urge you to check out Education Support website. They've got an incredible amount of resources on there, and they've also got a very, very good looking Welshman on there as well. So you might be able to have guessed by now who that is. And you know, people doing lots of things on there that are very, very supportive and very useful and very resourceful. But I'd also like to give you this website, which is a website that myself and many other people helped put together, and we were very grateful to everybody that contributed to the resource. And it's www.wellbeingandcoping.net. And on there you can find lots of things that will be helpful to people's well-being, both adults and young people. The other one I am going to share with you, which is very important for me to share with you, is if you do have staff members which are obviously in increasing amount of distress, remember, of course, that you can get in touch with education support, and of course it's better to do that sooner rather than later. But one of the websites that you will be able to visit for some help or some support, or maybe share that with a member of staff, is www.stayandsafe.net. So that is very, very important resource. That is NHS resource. You can use that at any time. And it might be that actually providing somebody with a safety plan and giving them a website resource might be very useful. I hope you never have to use it, but if you do, it's there for you 24 hours, 365 days a year. So thank you for everything that you're doing. Please take care of yourselves. I know that we're all willing you on, you know, even if we don't see you regularly and we don't get to see you for a while. Every single one of us is winning each other on at the moment. So there is always somebody that will always be here. I just want to finish on a very quick story. Yesterday, I was told a story from a school leader who said that that she'd had quite a challenging relationship actually with one of her colleagues down the road in another school, and there'd been lots of historic and cultural issues around the school and the catchment. And she said that she got into a car and she just felt so overwhelmed that she just burst into tears when she got into a car. And actually, the other head of the school was walking past the car park at the time and saw her. And she came to the car to check if she was okay. And she said that they've arranged to have coffee next week, because they both realised that they're both facing very difficult circumstances. And as much as they're a primary and a secondary head, you know, they're in different places, different parts of the system, they have a lot in common. And now they're holding those spaces for each other and just making sure that they've got that external support there if they need it. And I heard another story the other day of a vicar doing exactly the same thing. You know, this person said, I've got no faith whatsoever, but the vicar called to see how I was doing, see how I was. You know, all of those tiny little acts of kindness, all of those tiny little things that we can do to support each other, I think it's invaluable at the moment. If you've got any questions, please email me. My email is there. I will gladly get back to you as and when I can and answer your questions. And I will try and make sure that these slides get to you as well. Now, I'm going to hand back to Sinead, but what it will mean is that, oh, Sinead, I think I can hear your sound now. Has my sound come back on?
Well, if you can hear the hammering on my roof, then yeah, your sound's back on.
It's lovely to hear your voice again. I thought I was never going to hear it again.
we couldn't let that happen, Mike. Thank you so much for your presentation and your thoughts. I think I was very struck by and incidentally, I couldn't hear your dog at all. That might be because the neighbour's roof is deafening, but your dog was pretty quiet at my end. But just very struck what you're saying about at the end about people coming together. And actually, you know, a lot of our work is about trying to put formal structures in place and trying to make services available to people. But actually, the richness that just exists between people coming together informally is, I think, incredibly difficult to beat. And those support networks are things that we don't always remember to turn on and activate and reach out. And actually, it's another thing to do at some times. I've got, oh gosh, I should call such and such. But I was reminded of this myself because recently I'm a relatively new chief executive. I started in this role 18 months ago. And I joined a peer support group of charity chief executives about 2 months ago. And I was completely shocked, actually, at how much I got out of that opportunity, both in hearing what other people said and, to your point, Mike, I suppose being validated and acknowledged in the things that I chose to share. And they weren't revelatory, and it was not like I had some deep and profound insight to bring to the group, but just to have people in a similar situation reflect back and acknowledge the experience I was having, I found really surprisingly helpful. And it happened in an informal peer group setting, but I think it can also happen with colleagues we know in similar roles across the piece. So I think it's something for people to take away and think about. I don't know if anyone has any particular questions they'd like to ask at this time. Then we have a few minutes and we can have a conversation. And it may be that you don't have particular questions, and that's fine too. One of the things I was going to ask you about, Mike, because I know you have a keen interest in sport. I use a metaphor often when talking about rest and recovery, and we had a previous session before you arrived and we talked about that, talking about the need to look after ourselves and to rest and recover to be able to do our very best, put our best performance in. And I think there's something for me about not working. And for many of us, not working, we think, well, you know, we're not working, right? So that's great, we're taking rest. But actually, it's not the opposite of working. You know, the opposite, not working, you might think is the opposite of working, but it's not. We can be wandering around with work fizzing away in our heads and half our mind on something that we left on our desk, or an email that we, you know, didn't address, or a parent who we know we need to reach out to. And even though we're not working, we're still very full of it. It's still occupying kind of every piece of us. And so that need to recover, I think, comes in, or meeting the need to recover comes through allowing ourselves to be really fully absorbed in something else. not always easy for us to find the time to, but I think that's where the recovery comes. So I'm interested in your perspective from an athletic perspective, I suppose, as much as anything, but that thing about recovery, just if you have any other thoughts on that, Mike.
I do. And do you know what? I think there's a pressure on us to rest as well. So when you're trying to rest, you feel like actually you're worrying about resting. And then, for instance, if you find reading relaxing, when you're reading a book, you feel the pressure to read. And then halfway through, you're going, I don't feel relaxed. So then you get stressed about not being able to relax as well. So it's that perpetuating cycle. I won't bore you with the benefits of cell renewal and resting from anastatic load. I could talk about that for years. But instead, what I will say is resting comes in loads of different forms. And a perception of rest to just be lying on the sofa and actually not watching TV or lying on the sofa and not moving. It's not everyone's idea of rest. For some people, rest is gardening. For some people, rest is movement. So we have to incorporate different forms of rest. I will share a secret with you, and you please cannot tell anybody anything at all about this. When I watch to rest, I watch The Only Way is Essex. And I never thought I'd say that in any public forum, but you know why I watch it? I watch it because it's utter rubbish and I don't have to think about anything. If anything's intellectual in the evening, I don't want to watch it. I want to watch the cheapest, the worst, the trashiest TV I can possibly find. I'll take that any day. So obviously you'll have to sign a non-disclosure agreement on the way out of this session today. But that's my interpretation of resting. Okay, so the trashier the better. It comes in many forms. Don't put pressure on yourself to conform to other people's ways of resting because it won't work. You have to find your own path. Whatever it is, it's absolutely okay.
Excellent.
I bet that wasn't the answer you were expecting, was it?
Well, now I know what T-shirt to get you for Christmas, Mike. So that's been really helpful. And you have colleagues. You know, you've got people on your side sharing. Brilliant. Well, look at and jigsaw puzzles. Thank you, Chloe. Agree. Yes. We don't have any burning questions in the chat, so I'm going to end the session. I'm going to just draw your attention to the survey that Jennifer Hart has posted in the chat function. It's genuinely a 2-minute survey. If you fill it out, it's going to say, you know, was the session good, bad, or indifferent? But critically, there's also a question in there asking you about what else you might need. And if you can take the 2 minutes to fill it out, the work that we do through this program will be better because it'll be the stuff you told us you need. So please do, if you can, take 2 minutes and just give us your thoughts on that. We really appreciate it. We are back at 12:30 for the next session in the conference. And that's with Eileen Donnelly from Waterworks Wellbeing, and she'll be talking to us about how we look at wellbeing right back at a kind of even a national level, and their work is international, so they'll share some perspective from that. Thank you all so much for participating this morning, and thanks again to Mike for, as ever, grounding us in some really important and meaningful practice that we can all take away and work with. Colleagues, have a nice break. Please try and stretch your legs at some stage, and we'll see as many of you as can make it back at 12:30. Many thanks. Take care.